Brookdale was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect from the outside. The lawns were trimmed, the mailboxes were aligned, and the houses all carried the same dull beige paint that made everything blur together. Behind that picture of order, however, lived an HOA that thrived on control. They issued fines for the smallest of things: a trash can left out too long, a flower pot that wasn't approved, even a holiday decoration considered too loud. For most homeowners, these rules were a nuisance, but for Alan, they became the spark of something bigger. Alan wasn't a troublemaker. He had lived in Brookdale for over a decade, always keeping to himself, paying dues on time, and maintaining his property. The only thing that stood out was his wooden gate, an old but sturdy piece that had guarded his driveway since the day he moved in. Weather had worn it, yes, but it still worked just fine. One afternoon, Alan found a letter stuffed into his mailbox. The HOA logo sat at the top, and beneath it was the kind of message every homeowner in Brookdale dreaded. They declared his wooden gate unsightly and out of compliance. He had 30 days to replace it with a modern HOA-approved design or face daily fines. Most people in Brookdale obeyed these demands immediately. They knew better than to fight the board. But Alan saw the letter as an insult. His gate wasn't broken. It wasn't falling apart. It wasn't dangerous. It was simply old. And apparently, that was enough to offend the HOA's sense of perfection. Alan considered his options. He could pay thousands for a plain, HOA-approved replacement, blending in like everyone else. Or he could comply in a way the HOA never expected. That thought grew in his mind like wildfire. If they wanted him to replace his gate, he would replace it, but on his terms. That night, Alan sat at his kitchen table sketching ideas. He wanted something bold, something unforgettable. He wanted to follow the rules so perfectly that the HOA couldn't fine him, while at the same time mocking their obsession with control. Then it hit him. Gold. Not actual gold, of course, but a gate painted in brilliant metallic gold. Something that would shine in the sunlight, something that would turn heads and draw stares. A gate so out of place in Brookdale's beige monotony that it would expose the HOA's ridiculousness for all to see. Over the next few weeks, Alan quietly worked on his plan. He ordered lumber, heavy iron hinges, and most importantly, several gallons of special metallic gold paint. In his backyard, hidden from view, he built the new gate piece by piece. The design was sturdy but ornate, with carved details that would shimmer once painted. Every stroke of the brush was a statement. Every screw tightened was an act of defiance. Meanwhile, the HOA sent another warning letter. The deadline was closing in. Alan simply smiled. They had no idea what was coming on. The 30th day, Alan removed his old wooden gate and installed the new one. By the time the sun set, Brookdale had a new landmark. The golden gate gleamed under the fading light, catching every ray and throwing it back tenfold. It was impossible to ignore, loud, proud, and undeniably within the HOA's demand. By morning, word had spread. Neighbors slowed their cars to gawk. Children laughed and pointed. Some residents even took pictures, treating Alan's house like a tourist stop. What was once a quiet corner of Brookdale was now the most talked-about spot in the neighborhood. The HOA, however, was not amused. The very next day, Alan received a furious letter. The board called the gate inappropriate and not in harmony with community standards. They ordered him to take it down immediately. But Alan knew better. He had followed the letter of their rule. They asked for a replacement, and he gave them one. The battle lines were drawn. What started as a demand for a simple gate replacement had turned into something much larger, a fight over control, individuality, and just how far one homeowner was willing to go to stand up to the HOA, and this was only the beginning. The Golden. Gate quickly became more than just a boundary for Allen's property. It became a spectacle. Within days, photos of it began circulating on neighborhood Facebook groups. Some residents praised Allen's boldness, while others whispered about how tacky it looked. But regardless of opinion, no one could deny one thing. The gate had made Brookdale interesting again. For Allen, it was both amusing and satisfying. Each morning, he watched neighbors slow down to snap pictures, some even posing beside the gleaming entrance like it was a landmark. What had once been a bland, cookie-cutter street now had its own attraction. Allen saw this as harmless fun, but the HOA saw it as a direct challenge to their authority. The board called an emergency meeting. Their complaint was simple. While Allen had technically complied with their demand to replace the gate, he had done so in a way that violated the spirit of the community guidelines. They argued that Brookdale was meant to embody subtle elegance, not a gaudy circus display. The Golden Gate, in their eyes, was a stain on their carefully crafted image of order. The HOA sent Allen a second letter, this one harsher than the first. It demanded immediate removal of the gate, citing community harmony and visual disruption as reasons. If Allen refused, they threatened daily fines, escalating penalties, and even legal action. Allen read the letter carefully. He knew their game. They thrived on vague language, twisting rules to fit whatever they wanted. But the truth was simple. Nowhere in the HOA guidelines did it say he couldn't paint his gate gold. Nowhere did it say a gate had to be a certain color. They had only required that he replace the old wooden one. He had done exactly that. Rather than panic, Allen doubled down. He printed the HOA's original demand and taped it proudly to his front window for everyone to see. "Replace the gate," it read. Nothing more. Anyone who passed by could now see the proof that he was, in fact, following the rules. The board wasn't prepared for that move. Neighbors who disliked the HOA's heavy-handedness began rallying behind Allen. Some laughed at the absurdity of the situation. Others quietly admitted they admired his courage. After all, most residents had been fined or warned at some point for trivial things. But no one had ever fought back so openly. The Golden Gate became a symbol. It wasn't just about paint anymore. It was about freedom, about standing up to a group that had terrorized the community for years with threats and fines. Each day, more and more residents visited Allen's Corner just to see the infamous gate for themselves. But the HOA wasn't about to give up easily. A week later, they escalated their campaign. Instead of just letters, they began sending inspectors to Allen's property. They scoured every inch of his yard, every corner of his home, searching for violations. A weed in the flower bed? A fine. A recycling bin left out a little too long? Another fine. They hoped to break him through sheer persistence, burying him in penalties until he caved. Allen, however, refused to bend. He paid nothing, kept meticulous records, and documented every encounter. He took photos of the inspectors snooping around and shared them online, where neighbors began questioning why the HOA was targeting one man so aggressively. The situation spiraled further when local news outlets picked up the story. Golden. Gate sparks HOA battle in Brookdale, one headline read. Reporters showed up at Allen Street, cameras capturing the shining gate that had ignited a community war. Suddenly, this wasn't just a neighborhood squabble, it was public spectacle. The HOA board members hated the attention. For years, they had operated in the shadows, ruling with fear. Now their tactics were under scrutiny. Some residents began speaking up, sharing their own horror stories of unfair fines and power abuse. The Golden Gate had cracked something open, and it was spreading fast. Yet behind the smiles and the growing support, Allen knew he was in for a long fight. The HOA was cornered, and cornered groups tend to lash out. He had made his move, but the board wasn't finished. They had resources, lawyers, and an iron grip on the community's rules. As Allen stood one evening watching the sunset reflect brilliantly off his gate, he realized something important. This was no longer about him or his property. It was about exposing the HOA for what they really were, and he was willing to see it through no matter how far they tried to push him. The Golden Gate wasn't just a gate anymore. It was the start of a revolution in Brookdale. The Golden Gate continued to gleam under the summer sun, but now its glow carried a heavier meaning. It wasn't just a quirky feature of Allen's home. It was a rallying point, a statement against years of unchecked authority. Every morning, Allen noticed more neighbors walking their dogs a little slower, pausing longer at the corner, staring at the gate with quiet admiration. But while the residents were curious and supportive, the HOA board was unraveling. For years, they had enforced rules with little resistance. People grumbled, but eventually paid their fines or conformed. Now, for the first time, someone wasn't bending. Worse yet, the story had spread beyond Brookdale. The news coverage had shifted. Public opinion, painting Allen as the underdog and the HOA as the villain. Behind closed doors, the board meetings grew tense. The president of the HOA, Margaret, who neighbors privately called the Iron Lady, was furious. She had spent years building the neighborhood's pristine reputation, pruning it into the tidy, picture-perfect community she envisioned. And now, in her eyes, one man's painted gate threatened to undo it all. But not everyone on the board shared her view. A few members, weary of constant battles with homeowners, began to question whether the fight was worth it. They worried that the HOA's aggressive actions were backfiring, making them look tyrannical rather than professional. The unity that had once made the board so intimidating was beginning to fracture. Meanwhile, Allen kept living his life with quiet determination. He refused to remove the gate, refused to pay the fines, and refused to bow to intimidation. Instead, he began documenting everything even more carefully. Every letter from the HOA was scanned and saved. Every inspector's visit was recorded on his home security cameras. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was building a case. The neighbors noticed his composure and admired it. Whispers started spreading. If Allen could resist, maybe others could too. A family down the street who had been fined for having a slightly different mailbox design suddenly felt emboldened to challenge it. Another resident who had been forced to cut down her garden lights began openly complaining about the unfairness of it all. Allen's stand was inspiring something bigger than himself. The turning point came when a local lawyer, intrigued by the news reports, reached out to Allen. She specialized in property rights and HOA disputes, and she offered her services at a heavily reduced fee. Allen accepted without hesitation. With her guidance, he learned that many of the HOA's threats were hollow. While they could issue fines, many of their tactics, such as excessive inspections and vague demands, were legally questionable. When Allen pushed back with a lawyer's letter of his own, the HOA board was stunned. They had expected him to fold, under pressure, not escalate the fight with legal representation. The confidence they once carried began to waver. But Margaret, the HOA president, wasn't ready to surrender. To her, this was personal. She pushed for the board to file an official lawsuit against Allen, claiming his gate disrupted community values and caused depreciation of property values. Though some members hesitated, Margaret's influence was still strong enough. To push the motion forward, Allen soon received notice. The HOA was taking him to court. At first, the idea seemed intimidating. Court cases were expensive, time-consuming, and draining, but Allen wasn't alone anymore. His lawyer reassured him that the HOA's case was weak, built on vague accusations rather than concrete violations. His neighbors, too, began to show support in subtle but meaningful ways. Some brought over meals, others quietly donated money to his legal fund, and a few even offered to testify about their own negative experiences with the board. The Golden Gate once mocked as gaudy, had now become a banner under which the neighborhood began to unite. As the court date loomed, Alan prepared himself for what lay ahead. He knew the HOA would come at him with everything they had. He also knew Margaret wasn't just fighting to win the case. She was fighting to maintain her grip on power. But Alan also sensed something had changed. The HOA's armor was cracking, and for the first time in years, the people of Brookdale could see the truth beneath it. And if he played this right, he might not just keep his Golden Gate, he might just free the entire community from the HOA's stranglehold. The day of the hearing arrived with a weight that hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. Alan woke early, his nerves tight, but his resolve steady. He dressed neatly, gathered his documents, and met his lawyer outside. Together they drove to the courthouse while the Golden Gate shimmered in the morning sun behind them, as if sending him off with a quiet promise. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. On one side sat Alan and his attorney, calm but cautious. On the other, Margaret and the HOA board members filed in with stiff backs and sharp suits. Margaret wore her usual air of authority, chin lifted, as though victory was already assured. But beneath her polished exterior was an edge of desperation that only Alan could sense. The judge entered, and the case was called. What followed was a battle of words and evidence. The HOA's lawyer argued first, claiming that Alan's Golden Gate was excessively flamboyant and disrupted the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. They painted a picture of declining property values and a loss of community cohesion. Margaret nodded vigorously at every word, convinced the judge would see things her way. But when Alan's attorney rose, the narrative shifted. She calmly presented the HOA's own bylaws, pointing out that nowhere did it specify restrictions on gate color, material, or style. She argued that the HOA was enforcing personal preferences, not written rules. To drive the point home, she produced copies of the threatening letters, the excessive fines, and even the inspection logs, evidence that the HOA had gone far beyond reasonable enforcement. The judge's brow furrowed as he read through the documents. Then came the most powerful moment. Alan's lawyer called neighbors to testify. One by one, residents shared their stories of being fined for trivial matters. Flower pots slightly out of regulation, holiday lights left up a day too long, a child's basketball hoop left visible in the driveway. Their voices carried frustration, but also relief at finally being heard. Each testimony chipped away at the HOA's credibility, painting a picture of an organization less interested in protecting property values and more obsessed with control. Alan himself spoke last. With calm sincerity, he explained why he built the Golden Gate, because he loved his home, because he wanted to make something unique, and because the rules did not forbid it. He didn't lash out or accuse, he simply told his story, letting the absurdity of the situation reveal itself. When the HOA's turn came again, their argument sounded hollow. Margaret's frustration boiled over as she tried to insist that the neighborhood's identity was at stake, but the judge interrupted her, reminding her that personal taste was not enforceable law. By the end of the day, the decision was clear. The judge ruled in Alan's favor, declaring that the Golden Gate did not violate the HOA's bylaws. Furthermore, the court criticized the HOA's excessive fines and harassment, ordering them to reimburse Alan for the legal costs he incurred. The ruling was decisive, and it sent shockwaves through the board. Alan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he also knew this was more than a personal victory. As he walked out of the courthouse, reporters surrounded him, eager to capture the moment. His calm smile and simple statement that homeowners had the right to live without fear of petty tyranny struck a chord far beyond Brookdale. Back in the neighborhood, word spread quickly. The Golden Gate was no longer just a symbol of defiance. It was a symbol of victory. Neighbors congratulated Alan, and whispers began circulating that the HOA board itself might face a reckoning. Margaret, however, was livid. Though she had lost in court, she was not ready to relinquish control. Her pride had been wounded, and in her mind, Alan had humiliated her. As she retreated from the courthouse, her mind churned with new schemes, desperate to find another way to reassert her dominance. But the tide was turning. The cracks in the HOA's armor were no longer cracks. They were gaping fractures, and the community was beginning to realize that they had more power than they'd ever imagined. The battle in court had ended, but the war for Brookdale's future had only just begun. The courthouse victory shook Brookdale to its core. For years, residents had silently endured the HOA's iron grip, paying fines without question, repainting fences at Margaret's demand, and trimming hedges to the exact inch prescribed by arbitrary inspections. But now, Alan's triumph had lit a spark. Neighbors who once stayed quiet now found their voices. At morning walks, at backyard barbecues, even at the local grocery store, conversations revolved around one thing: the Golden Gate and what it meant for them. If Alan could stand up and win, maybe they could too. The HOA board, however, reacted in predictable fashion. They released a newsletter dripping with condescension, declaring that the court ruling was a technicality and urging residents to support the preservation of Brookdale's values. But the tone felt hollow. Residents no longer feared them. Instead, many began openly criticizing the board, their voices louder than ever before. Margaret tried to reassert control with emergency meetings, but attendance was sparse. Those who did show up came not to support her, but to challenge her. They questioned where HOA funds were going, why so much money was spent on legal battles, and why the board operated in secrecy. One evening, a group of neighbors gathered at Alan's home. The Golden Gate gleamed behind them as they sat in his living room, sharing stories of harassment and brainstorming solutions. The idea of reforming or even dissolving the HOA no longer seemed like a fantasy. It was a real possibility. They decided to act. Petitions circulated through the neighborhood, calling for a recall of the current board. Signatures poured in faster than Margaret expected. Residents who had never spoken out before were eager to sign, tired of being treated like misbehaving children in their own homes. Margaret fought back with fury. She went door to door, warning residents that without the HOA, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. She claimed property values would plummet, lawns would rot, and Brookdale would become a wasteland. But her words rang hollow against the reality people lived every day. It wasn't Alan's Gate that was ruining the community. It was the endless rules and fines. As the recall vote drew near, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Lawn signs appeared, some supporting Margaret, others demanding change. Social media groups buzzed with debates, and local reporters returned to cover the unfolding drama. Brookdale was no longer just a quiet suburb, it was a battleground. The day of the vote, residents lined up at the clubhouse. The turnout was unprecedented. People who had never attended a meeting in their lives arrived, determined to make their voices heard. Margaret presided over the proceedings with a forced smile, but sweat glistened on her brow. She could feel her empire slipping. When the votes were counted, the result was undeniable. The board was ousted. Margaret and her allies were removed from power, replaced by a new group of residents determined to bring transparency and fairness to the HOA, or to dismantle it entirely. The announcement was met with cheers. Some residents cried tears of relief, others embraced, and many simply stood in awe at what they had accomplished. The Golden Gate had started as a single man's act of defiance, but now it had sparked a revolution. Margaret, however, did not stay to face the crowd. She slipped out of the clubhouse quietly, her pride shattered. For years, she had wielded fear like a weapon. But now, stripped of her authority, she was just another neighbor. That night, Brookdale felt different. For the first time in years, the streets seemed lighter, freer. Families gathered outside, children played without fear of complaints, and laughter echoed where silence once ruled. The Golden Gate glowed under the streetlights, more radiant than ever, a monument to resistance and resilience. Yet even as residents celebrated, Allen knew the story wasn't over. Reforming the HOA, or abolishing it, would not be simple. Margaret might be gone, but the scars of her reign remained. Still, for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Brookdale was changing, and Allen, once just an ordinary homeowner with a gate, had become the unlikely symbol of that change. But while the board had fallen, Margaret's pride was not so easily defeated. In the shadows of her quiet home, she nursed her anger already, plotting ways to regain control, unwilling to accept that her empire was truly gone. The Battle of Brookdale was shifting, but it was far from finished. The weeks following the recall election felt like a new dawn in Brookdale. The neighborhood, that once lived under the constant threat of fines and citations, now breathed freely. Families repainted their homes in colors they actually liked. Kids left their bicycles on lawns without fearing penalty slips. For the first time in years, residents felt like homeowners rather than tenants of a tyrannical board. The new HOA leadership, comprised of regular neighbors, set a different tone immediately. They held open meetings where everyone could contribute, published clear financial records, and most importantly, vowed to stop using the association as a weapon against residents. Some even proposed the complete dissolution of the HOA, though that process would take time and legal wrangling. Still, the sentiment was clear. Never again would Brookdale tolerate another Margaret. The Golden Gate stood at the center of it all, no longer just Allen's private entrance, but a shared symbol. Couples posed for photos in front of it during evening walks. Teenagers snapped selfies there, posting them with hashtags that mocked the old HOA regime. Even local businesses saw a boost, as visitors came by just to glimpse the infamous gate that defeated the HOA. Allen himself was astonished at what his act of stubborn creativity had ignited. He never intended to lead a movement. He only wanted to keep his property as he saw fit. Yet neighbors now looked to him for guidance. They invited him to community meetings, asked for advice, and treated him as the voice of Brookdale's transformation. But not everyone celebrated. Margaret, stripped of her title, retreated into isolation. Rumors swirled that she had tried to start lawsuits, but none gained traction. Without the HOA's backing, she was just another homeowner, and her threats carried no weight. She became a ghost in the neighborhood she once ruled, her blinds drawn, her yard unkempt, a silent reminder of how power can collapse overnight. For Allen, the victory came with quiet reflection. He often stood by the gate at dusk, watching as the golden surface caught the fading sunlight, casting a warm glow across the street. To him, it wasn't about rebellion anymore. It was about dignity, the simple right to live without constant interference. As months turned to a year, Brookdale thrived. The media occasionally revisited the story, updating viewers on how the once feared HOA had collapsed. Journalists marveled at how a single painted gate could unravel years of authoritarian rule. Some even called it the gate that freed Brookdale, a phrase that stuck. The Golden Gate became a local landmark, marked on maps as a quirky tourist attraction. Visitors stopped by, curious about the tale of a community that had toppled its rulers. Allen welcomed them warmly, never failing to share how it all began with a simple letter demanding he replace his outdated wooden gate. The HOA still technically existed, but it was unrecognizable compared to the past. It no longer functioned as an overseer, but as a resource, helping with neighborhood events, coordinating safety patrols, and maintaining common spaces. Where fear once prevailed, cooperation now thrived. Looking back, Alan realized the irony. The HOA had wanted conformity, a neighborhood where individuality was erased under a blanket of rules. But it was precisely because of their obsession with control that the Golden Gate came into existence. By trying to suppress freedom, they had created the very symbol that destroyed their authority. The legacy of the gate stretched beyond Brookdale. Other neighborhoods heard the story and took inspiration. Homeowners stood up to overreaching HOAs, citing Allen's case as proof that change was possible. Online forums shared photos of Brookdale, turning the Golden Gate into an emblem of defiance across the country. For Allen, life eventually returned to normal, but never quite the same. He remained a homeowner, yes, but also a storyteller, reminded daily that sometimes the smallest acts can spark the biggest changes. He found joy in watching families stop by his gate, children pointing at it with wide eyes, parents explaining the story. It was never really about the gold paint, he thought. It was about standing firm when pushed too far. As another sunset bathed the neighborhood in warm light, Allen smiled. The battle was behind them, the tyranny defeated, the community reborn. The Golden Gate shimmered like a crown at Brookdale's entrance, no longer a symbol of defiance, but of unity and resilience. The HOA had demanded Allen replace his wooden gate. Instead, he built a golden one. And in doing so, he built freedom for everyone.